And so we're just to welcome everybody into the room. And we are in the substantive day 3, the final day of the DSAI conference. The first day, we just had a fantastic keynote talk from Gustavo Esteva, who I suppose brought us in very kind of a hopeful, but also critical directions. And then yesterday we had a very full day with the opening climate session, and then we had breakout sessions and a keynote by Sarah Lister. There's really far too much for me to go through to have a recap of all the content, but the proceedings were recorded. So if anybody would like to catch up with any discussions that they've missed, we've had packed sessions with very engaged and in-depth questions and discussion, and it's been really thoroughly enjoyable. So I point you to that to catch up if you'd like on the DSAI website. So what I might do at this point is to ask Petronella Peters, Ellen, to introduce or give a background to Sinead Walsh, who's going to come in. She's in the middle of the negotiations now, but she's going to come in a little bit late and hopefully give us an update. But if you'd like to just maybe give the bio details and get everybody ready, and then maybe we can have a chat between ourselves whilst waiting for Sinead. Okay. It's lovely to see friends coming into the room.
Yeah, it's great to see more and more people joining as well. That's wonderful. Yeah, so I'll just quickly tell you about Sinead Walsh. It's Dr. Sinead Walsh. She's a climate director for the Department of Foreign Affairs in Ireland. And she has been in that role since 2020. Prior to that, she served as the EU ambassador to South Sudan, and she has worked for the Department of Foreign Affairs since 2009. She was a senior fellow at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative in 2016 and 17. And prior to that, she served as the Irish ambassador to Sierra Leone and Liberia, and as head of Irish Aid in both these countries between 2011 and 2016. She also worked for DFA in headquarters in various various kind of different roles, including working with the international finance institutions, multilateral organizations, and she did some work on civil society as well. Before joining government, Sinead spent 10 years in the NGO sector. She worked primarily for Concern Worldwide in India, Pakistan, Rwanda, and South Sudan. And she worked in global advocacy as well. She has a BA from Harvard and MSc in Development Studies from UCD and a PhD in Social Policy from the London School of Economics. She co-authored a book, Getting to Zero, a doctor and a diplomat on the Ebola frontline, about her experience of living through the Ebola epidemic in Sierra Leone, which I can highly recommend. Yeah, so that's Sinead, and yes, as you say, she's at COP at the moment, and hoping to join us here in about 5 minutes. So that's we'll wait for her.
In the meantime, maybe we can, if anybody can recall, we had this kind of briefing also yesterday at the beginning of day 1, and we had Dermot Toney from the space in Glasgow, and giving us a kind of like an on the ground little briefing about what's going on and his impressions, and it was really, really helpful because I really got you into the space. So I don't know if anybody wants to say anything about that, but yeah, I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I think that was great, and Sive O'Neill also contributed from COP, and I think both of their contributions were great. Just their ideas of around kind of how, are we supposed to be optimistic, pessimistic? What's going to come out of this, and just generally, I think the role of the various mechanisms that are being agreed beyond the, the overall kind of signing of a deal. There's so many mechanisms. Su-Ming, you had a really interesting discussion about some particular mechanism on reparations, was it? And it's really interesting to see the detail that emerged from that, and whether or not sort of individual parts of the climate agreements and how they work and whether they work.
I think the most important thing. Hi, Amita. Lovely to see you after so many years. So I think one of the quotes that I took from Diarmuid was, it was an important political moment to hold the governments into account. It also shines a light on what governments are doing and not doing. And that was what COP26 probably would be remembered for, I would say. And yeah, assuming the case for loss and damage is crucial. I think that is the conversation that's happening in India.
So it really appeared to me that there's this kind of world of negotiations, the technical instruments, the state parties, the negotiations, and that's extremely complex and very involved. And then there's this kind of like hard deadline that they're trying to get to. So that also puts political pressure. And meanwhile, it's also a media event, and it's a civil society engagement through the media and with the media event. So that also kind of adds to the kind of political pressure. But then I really got this that was the big question that was there for me, really, was, where the top down and the bottom up were meeting, and were they really going to meet in the middle? And are these measures, which are, of course, the political solutions, actually going to deliver, remedies for people who need the remedies right now and action right now? So rather than, just telling people to take action, or encouraging the people to take action, or, educating people that the action needs to be taken, that was the kind of takeaway for me, I think.
Thanks. I just wanted to tell everyone who just joined in that we are waiting for Sinead Walsh to join us. She's busy right now, so we decided we will have a chat amongst us while we wait for Sinead Walsh to join in. So you are all welcome to put on your cameras and say if you want to join in the conversation. But to add to Su-Ming, one of the speakers yesterday said there's a situation of ungovernability, and the whole confusion about who's in charge and who sets the standards, wherein I said, linking to Manisha Rao's point also, that on differentiated responsibilities, and it is in our local context that the responsibilities lie. I know if you want to say something on that, anybody wants to join in. And I think we'll hear more in that critical development panel today.
Yeah, I didn't want to join in too much because I already have selfishly taken one whole panel to arrange conversations, so which we will definitely go to in a quarter of an hour.
I know the other quotation for me from yesterday was, there's a hunger for political engagement by the youth, which connects us to the youth social movements today, environmental movements. And I thought those, that there are a few, instances in the last 1.5 days, which I think are momentous for us, probably as scholars, and gives us a cue to how to go forward, and be probably critical. So I won't take away from the panel now, which is.
I think the yesterday's keynote was kind of was a bit of a not quite a wake-up call, but kind of put all of our discussions into context in terms of Sarah Lister's kind of painting the picture of global governance and the fact that so many that for example this year has seen more coups than the past 5 years, and just generally kind of reminding us that that certainly COVID has kind of given lots of countries a license to curb people's freedoms, well beyond what's really necessary for for medical reasons, and it's been interesting to see, to kind of how to arrange that. There's
no, Sinead is here now. We see her.
Okay. Hi,
Hi,
Sinead.
folks. Sorry, it's a bit mad here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Yep.
Welcome.
My mask, but then I'm trying to have good Wi-Fi, so I'm trying to find the balance between those two things.
Very normal problems.
Yeah, but let me see if I can, I think I have the Wi-Fi sorted now. Let me see if I can find somewhere to take off the mask. So what would you like to know?
It would be great if you could give us a recap, just a general impression of how things have gone. How are things at kind of negotiation level? How's engagement been with civil society? I think we'd like to know everything. Just
okay. Well, I'm like everybody else here. I'm very sleep deprived, so I will give you probably a flow of consciousness. There's a protest actually that's just happening. I don't know what it's about, but I'll let you know if I find out. Essentially, I mean, today is the last day, so negotiations are very, very hot. So Minister Eamon Ryan is here, as you probably know, leading the Irish delegation. I was just briefing him as he went from an EU meeting to a high ambition coalition meeting. A draft of some of the negotiating text came out this morning. I guess it's on the website, so maybe some people have even seen it. But it's one of these things that, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So, this is all basically what today is going to be about, and I would imagine very likely tomorrow, because there's different elements of the text, and you can't take for granted anything that's in the draft because it could be traded for something else, if you know what I mean. So, I can't really say a great deal about the text because obviously we're negotiating with the EU, and that's confidential, just in case there's any spies on the Zoom from somewhere else, but I doubt that. But in a way, it doesn't really matter because anything that's in the draft now could change. But there's certainly some really good stuff in the draft that we hope stays in there, and there's certainly other things that we would like to be stronger. I suppose I can maybe try to give you a bit of a sense overall, of kind of the mood and the tone that might be. I mean, I think the mood has improved. I think that the leaders was very helpful actually last week. First to the COP last Monday and Tuesday. The leader there, the Taoiseach, among them, and there was a lot of announcements and declarations and so on that were made that I think have helped to improve the kind of tone of these negotiations. I mean, I don't know really everybody online how much people know about the COP and what it is, but I think you guys had a session yesterday. I know Simon and Dermot were involved with something, so I assume you may all have a pretty good sense. But I mean, a kind of a headline is that, on the one hand, the main function of the COP is about negotiation, and that is really the core of it. On the other hand, there are a lot of other activities that happen around the COP, and I want to say this is particularly the case this time because it's in Glasgow, so it's, I suppose, quite convenient for a lot of sort of US and European activists to come. So it's this enormous, sort of up to 50,000 people. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of side events going on, literally from, I don't know, maybe 8:30 in the morning to 9:30 at night on any number of topics. There's pavilions where those side events are happening. There's some on science, there's some on the link with health, and then there's country pavilions, and there's pavilions on forestry, on biodiversity. I mean, you name it, every aspect of what's going on. So there's this whole non-negotiation space, which I think has become increasingly important. And I would imagine this is the peak that anybody has ever seen in terms of just the sheer size and scope and activity of the non-negotiation space. And on the one hand, you could be a bit dismissive of that, and you could say, well, look, what we're really here for is negotiations, is to get 197 countries to agree on this text, and that's true. But actually, a lot of the things that happen, as we say, outside the room can be very significant as well. So last week, for example, there was a global methane pledge, which could be hugely significant. There's a goal of collectively cutting methane by 30% by 2030. And methane, as people probably know, is a much more powerful gas compared to carbon dioxide. Sorry, there's lots of noisy things happening out here. Even though it's short-lived. And so I think there's a real, and Ireland signed up to that pledge, which was really good. So that's something that could potentially be really significant. Let's see a better spot to sit over here. There was also a forestry pledge on ending deforestation that was signed by over 100 countries. I think that was very significant as well. A couple of and there were several other pledges. It was like financial sector, kind of 40% of companies. I think it's like 250 companies that own 40% of the assets in the world came together and signed a pledge. So there's a lot of outside the room stuff happening that really does, I think, add up to quite a lot, and also helps, in some cases to influence some of the negotiations. So that's been good. Ireland has signed up to a few of these, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which is a good pledge as well as the methane pledge. And it may also, I assume it won't have escaped the notice of people on this call that the Taoiseach made an announcement to more than double Ireland's climate finance by 2025, and that's kind of the area, I suppose, where I'm sort of most involved in. So we're quite happy about that. So yeah, there's been a sort of a big. I mean, it's incredibly, I've heard it described as a circus. It's an incredibly chaotic process that's going on. Negotiations are happening, all the time until early morning, late at night. What we're doing at the moment, Minister Eamon Ryan is here. He's been here all week. We had our two ministers from Department of Foreign Affairs here during the week as well, Simon Coveney and Colin Brophy. They've now left. Minister Eamon Ryan is here as the head of the Irish delegation, and he's basically kind of, shuttling around from room to room. He's got a special role in a couple of areas now on transparency and on climate finance. So, we're helping him along with obviously his own colleagues. John Kerry is just walking past me there. I don't know if you could see that, but that was John Kerry. He's been here for the whole 2 weeks. Extraordinary. And actually that was one important pledge I meant to mention. The US and China kind of came out with a declaration on Wednesday evening about jointly enhancing climate action, which I think everybody knows could be really, really significant. So I understand that John Kerry visited China 17 times this year. So it just shows you the amount of effort that he's putting into this, and alongside a lot of other people as well. But our main focus today really is supporting the minister in this sort of shuttle diplomacy where there's certain language in the text that we either want to protect or we want to strengthen, and trying to get other people on board. And our initial objective is always to influence the EU position, because the EU negotiates on behalf of Ireland and all the other member states here. So, you know, yesterday we would have had bilaterals with EU countries and so on various bits and pieces. So yeah, so still very open. I will probably finish with that, but happy to answer any questions that you have. I can see now if Eamon Ryan comes out of the meeting that he's in, so I'm in a safe spot that I can see him from a distance if I need to run away. But that's kind of the summary, is that there's still quite a lot to do during the day to try to, you know, as I say, either protect good text or try to strengthen some of the text and the decisions that came out sometime early this morning. Yeah, so we'll be kind of engaged in that shuttling. I would imagine until late at night, and very, very possibly, I would say probably at this stage through tomorrow as well. So I might leave it at that and maybe just see if you have any questions.
Just overall, Sinead, I wonder, do you feel that the text that you might end up with, that is likely that you end up is something that will be proud of, like as Ireland, as EU? Is it something, when we kind of compare it to previous COP meetings, is this a way forward? Is this tackling anything that we need to tackle, or is it still hampered by a lot of lobbies, vested interests, and you know, people and countries that really want to maintain the status quo?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be both. It's going to be both. I think it's going to be. I think it will be progress. I think there is enough in the draft that even if we lose one or two of the good things, we'll still end up with some good things, and we may get a bit more on some of the areas, you know, that look a bit weak to us at the moment. So I don't think it's overall a bad draft. And you know, definitely some stuff in there that we're like, oh great, that's still in there, because this is, you know, we've obviously been working on different drafts, and this is you know, this is a revised draft of what we got before. So but at the same time, I think, you know, your second point is also valid, that, you know, there are definitely countries that are not on the same page, and that will you know, will be, you know, and whether it's, you know, fossil fuel interests, you know, fundamentally it is interests, you know, whether you say it's coming from companies or the countries themselves, whatever is another story. But essentially, you know, it is countries in the negotiating room. So there's definitely still, you know, I suppose what we would consider spoilers in this, who really just don't want the transition to happen, or want it to happen more slowly. I mean, I will say that, you know, we're now up to, okay, let me get this right, 80, I want to say it's 85%, it's definitely high 80s of countries that have made net zero commitments. So I think, and that's up from, I think it was 50% in January of this year. So that's maybe another significant thing to mention. India made a 2070 commitment last week. Now, of course, everybody would want that to be an earlier commitment by India, which is just incredibly significant country in terms of all of this. But, you know, some people are saying, look, at least they made a net zero commitment, and it gives us a direction of travel. And I spoke to somebody the other night who specializes in India, and this, you know, sort of, you know, pushing India towards net zero and academic. And her feeling was, actually, I think they'll do it earlier. And this is a start. Of course, we would have liked it if they'd said 2060, or we never thought they'd say 2050, but at least they've said net zero. And so you are sort of seeing this general kind of, you know, peer pressure in terms of individual country commitments, you know, which is again quite apart from what it's going to say in the text of this decision, obviously, because the Paris Agreement agreed that, you know, it was up to countries to make sort of voluntary commitments, as opposed to the previous Kyoto regime, which didn't work very well, which was more kind of a top-down process on emission reduction. So that, I mean, that is the playing field, you know, I think I would say I don't think, and it's very, you know, it's very difficult to say this, of course, because as I say, until everything is agreed, nothing is agreed. But I think Glasgow will be seen as probably at least a qualified success. If you take alone the declarations that have been made in the last couple of weeks, that is already there's already quite a lot of positives in there. And I, as I said, the text on your question, Ellen, I think the text is definitely has some good stuff in there. So, and I'd be very surprised if all of it disappears overnight. So I think, you know, like most of these things, there'll be some things we're happy with, there'll be some things we're unhappy with, but I suspect Glasgow will still be seen as having been a step forward.
Now, Sinead, I know that we are actually a minute into the next session already, but there is a question from Jordan Aberman in the chat. So I have asked Jordan to unmute. But I don't know if that's working or not.
Yeah, I just read it I'm on my phone here,
yeah.
But I just read it in case he can't.
Yeah, it's about the beyond oil and gas.
The BOGA.
The momentum.
Yeah, so again, I think that's good. And I think it's good that we signed it. It's something we've been discussing with the Danes and the Costa Ricans now for I don't know, maybe a year or something like that. It's Department of Environment, as you would imagine, that's leading on this. I think that is significant because a lot of the focus up to now has been on coal and phasing out coal and phasing out financing of coal overseas, and we have made some good progress on that. And this is now getting into oil and gas, and I think particularly gas is significant because there's a lot of countries that would say, oh well, you know, let's just hang on to gas, it's not as bad, and let's use it as a transition fuel. And there's a certain logic to that, but then there's also, you know, it's still a fossil fuel, it's still emissions, and how long is this transition going to be? So I think it's good to you know, make serious commitments on coal, oil, and gas. So I think BOGA is good news, and I give a lot of credit to the Danes, because I don't know if Denmark and Costa Rica kind of split up the countries, but I know the Danes, you know, just harassed us constantly because I was copied on the emails to be like, hey, do you have any questions? And, you know, here's more information, and, you know, how are you doing? And are you going to sign? And so I can tell you there's a lot of BOGA emails in my inbox. So they put a lot of energy into this, and I'm glad that they got so many signatories.
That's great. Thank you very much. No other questions, and we're aware that you've plenty to get on with. Jordan Aberman certainly says thank you as well. It's great that you got to give us an insight in the positive lobbying by Denmark in this case. And I think on behalf of all of us, thanks very much and good luck with the rest of today and maybe tomorrow. Yeah, we hope for the best possible text and the best possible action to follow.
Great. All right. Bye, guys.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Okay, so that's really great to get that insight, I think, from from the person who's representing our country in the negotiations, and that sense of that. But yeah, so now my job is to transition into the critical development studies panel straight away. So as chair of this panel, so I'm Su-Ming Khoo at NUI Galway, a sociologist, and I'm going to warmly welcome the 3 critical development studies speakers that we've invited onto this panel for today. And they are Marton Demeter, Amitabh Baviskar, and Stephen McCloskey. And just to very briefly reflect on Gustavo Esteva's first opening keynote on the Wednesday evening, he really kind of pointed to the importance of hope and surprise and creativity and friendship. And so I'm really, really delighted to invite friends old and new into this space, because I think this is really what will take development studies onward and through a very difficult and challenging time. There are full biographies of the 3 speakers in the annual conference program, so I'm not going to read out everything, but each of these speakers is extremely distinguished in their own right. So Marton is associate professor in the University of Public Service in Hungary, and a fellow of the Hungarian Academy of Social Science. And he's an expert in academic knowledge production from a different perspective, and has done extremely interesting work on scientometrics and on the empirical and quantitative side of scientific knowledge and what it means today. So I think that this is a great way, a very different way, and a great way to kind of open our critical development studies panel. There's questions about quantity, quality of knowledge, where it's coming from, and what it means when we actually study it. Amitabh Baviskar is a professor of environmental studies at Ashoka University. She is one of the most distinguished and insightful environmental sociologists I have ever had the privilege to meet and to read. Her work on city, on water, on social movements is a must read. So there's more details in the conference brochure, but she brings this sociological, but also I think a very anthropological perspective, which will really complement and expand the way we think about critical development studies, and gives it a sort of materiality, concreteness, and sociality that is really essential for a critical perspective on development. Finally, an old friend and collaborator, Stephen McCloskey, who's the director of the Centre for Global Education in Belfast, someone who I've accompanied since the very beginning of my academic career, who is an educator, development educator, a critical educator, a solidarity campaigner, and the founding editor of the journal Policy and Practice, a Development Education Review. So that's a very short introduction. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over the hosting to Marton, and he can add any anything that he wants to my very brief introduction, to introduce himself any further, and also to start his screen sharing as well. And at the end of that, then if you would pass the hosting on to Amita, and if Amita, you can do the same for Stephen. I propose that each of the speakers speaks for about 20 minutes, no more than, and that will leave 5 minutes for me to just have a very quick response, and then about 20 minutes or so for the audience to participate and discuss.
Okay, thank you very much. I think your introduction was totally perfect, because I always thought that my approach is specific, because I normally use quantitative measurements and scientometrics, but I try to interpret my findings in a more critical way, because one of the main problems, in my opinion, is with scientometrics that it does not typically discuss the results or the significance of the results. So what I would like to do is to make empirical measurements, analysis, but also to interpret my findings. I would like to take a shorter presentation in order to save some time for the discussion. So let me start it with sharing my screen. Okay, so can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So
it's in the view which has slides on one side and then the current slide in the middle. Yeah. So if you want to do the present slide
yes.
format.
I will try to do it, but unfortunately, this is not so easy.
Yes.
Now it's okay. Okay, so in this presentation, I would like to take an emphasis on how academic labor and academic capital relates to each other, because I think it can be a source of a very severe inequality within a field. So I will start with some theoretical discussion, and then I will focus on development studies as a case study. So yeah, first I would like to let you know something about academic capital, which is a main concept of field theory. It was introduced by Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist. For me, for my empirical analysis, academic capital consists of all those degrees, diplomas that scholars collect during their life, during their career trajectories. And it can be a very long process to collect academic capital. So let's imagine that somebody from Eastern Europe, or in my case from Hungary, start his education at the global north, for example, in the UK or in the US. I will spend 3 years in my bachelor study, and then 2 years in my master's study, about 6 years in PhD, and 2 years in a postdoctoral level. That means that I will spend more than 10 years in Western academia, and my academic capital, or in other words, my knowledge, but I will make some distinction between capital and knowledge, because the first relates to prestige, the second is something that is more practical. So academic capital accumulation is a relatively long process, and it is just the first stage, because after that you might get a position at a Western university. You will be an assistant professor, an associate professor, and at the end of the day a full professor. And I think that your positions at the Western academia also a part of your academic capital. Nowadays, recruitment processes, according to my tentative model, seems like that. So first, there are faculties that would like to recruit people, recruit scholars, and they were looking for typically those applicants that came from elite universities. They are located almost without exception at the global north. Yeah, because they think that they have some potential. The assumption behind this decision is the mainstream narrative by which elite schools provide the most talented scholars, the most hardworking scholars or students. They have better network. These universities are very selective, so we can assume that those scholars came from elite universities are somehow better than those working or being educated at low-ranked universities. Once they are recruited by these elite departments, they will get more supportive environment, better infrastructure, better network. Maybe they will get better knowledge, and they will be funded, and the results will be better production. So if your circumstances, your infrastructure are better, we can suggest that your production will be better. So this is somehow a positive circle. Better capacities will result in better production. The problem is that those degrees that you can get from different sides of the world are very different in the prestige level. So this figure shows the regional distribution of transnational academic.
Marton, they're not seeing the slides advancing. We're still stuck on slide 2.
Oh my God. Why? So now.
Yes, now it's moving.
Okay, so maybe. Okay.
Yeah, that's the right figure.
Okay, so this was my model. You can see the processes here. I won't repeat my argumentation, but I hope it could be followed without the picture. And now I think everything will be better. So in this figure, you can see how effectively academic capital can be accumulated in different parts of the world. This is a result from empirical research in which we checked the PhD degrees, or more precisely, the places of the PhD degrees that were accepted at elite university departments. And you can see that the this transnational academic capital refers to a feature of a degree that they can be used in another countries. So, for example, if if we say that the American PhDs are transnational, that means that you can use, or your PhD degree will be accepted by other parts of the world. So, in this sense, can we say that these capital, or these accumulated capital that you can get during education is transnational? And if we checked other countries, this transnational value of degrees outside the US or outside the UK are lower and lower. And for example, if you are from I don't know, from Africa, you have your PhD from an African university, its transnational value will be extremely low. So it's not very likely that you will get a job in a Western university if you have your education outside the global north. We have some ethical implications because in this case, talent, hard work, efforts, and achievements might be less important than capital. So it's more likely that you will be employed if you have elite degrees, but not too much achievements in terms of publication, than to get a job even if you have a very, very excellent level of publication, but you don't have these elite degrees, or in other words, your academic capital is low, your labor is excellent, your production is excellent, but since the field puts more emphasis on academic capital, you actually won't get the job, you won't invite to interviews, because in the first rounds, selection committees has a tendency to invite only those scholars or applicants to the interview that have elite education, and production is less important. So in other words, prestige might be more important than merits. They also have practical implications, and for that I just give a case. If employee A and employee B have the same level of production, but A has less capital than B, then which one is the more productive? Obviously, employer E, because if you can give the same production with less capital, you are most productive than those that have more capital but can produce just like you. So what happens if we support employee A who has less capital? Obviously, she will outshine the production of employee B, because additional capital will enhance her productivity. So this is more rational or more practical, or it would be more practical to recruit employee A. But in the academia, exactly the opposite happens. It is much more likely to recruit scholars with elite diploma, so with much academic capital, but without excellent production, than to recruit scholars with excellent production, but without elite diploma. And also we have the phenomenon of academic inbreeding, by which university departments have a tendency to recruit their or former PhD students. And as a case study, I will show some case study on sociology and on development studies. In this figure, you can see the education and career trajectories of more than 3,300 scholars. We collected data from the top 100 departments in sociology, and we find that there was no one. So there was actually no one from these more than 3,000 scholars without a diploma from one of the elite universities. So there were no scholars with full global South education. So it was, again, impossible to get a job in the Western world without having a Western, or more precisely, an elite Western education. In this case, you can see 3 world regions. The US is indicated with blue, the UK with green, and the red Western Europe. And you cannot see any other colors, because there were no scholars there were no scholars with an education outside the Western world. We could not find anybody with a PhD from Africa or Asia or from the Middle East or from Latin America or from Eastern Europe. So the extent of elitism is very, very extremely high because we don't have about 10 people with, beyond the Western world. So it's very extreme. And the same holds for development studies. Here we analyze the career trajectories of faculty members in 10 leading development studies department, from which 8 is located at the global north, typically in the US and in the UK. And as you can see from the colors, UK and US universities totally rule the field. So if you check your department, I don't know if your departments are counted in this specific research, but if you check your department, maybe it will be hard for you to find anybody without some level of Western education. So, and this doesn't mean, of course, that there were no scholars that originated beyond the Western world, because you can see that, for example, in the case of Asia, there were several scholars who get their education on the BA or the bachelor level in Asia or in Latin America or in Africa, Middle East. But actually on the master's level, the proportion is lower. So what does it mean? Most of these scholars have to go to the Western world for their master's studies. And on the PhD level, the proportion of those scholars that can have a position at the Western world without Western PhD is exactly 0. So all of these students had to go to one of the Western universities in order to get the job, while the original proportion of those scholars that have their bachelor level education beyond the Western world was more than 10%. And also in development studies, or finding testify that the academic inbreeding is extremely high. So the mean academic inbreeding proportion of the analyzed universities was almost 30%, with the leading of the University of Cambridge, who has department members in development studies with more than 70% educated on master's and PhD level at the University of Cambridge. But the situation is not far better in Manchester University or the University of Manchester and the SOAS University of London, when they also tend to employ their own former masters and or PhD students. The questions, I won't have time to answer them, so they are really questions that if elite education provides better knowledge, should it be reflected in the production level too? So because of that, we have the Matthew or the rich gets richer phenomenon. They might provide better knowledge, but that should be mirrored in better production. But beyond production, we also take emphasis on elite education in recruitment processes. What are the other question? What are the epistemic and scholarly justifications for academic inbreeding? How does it affect diversity? What surplus knowledge could offer many people with the same education? Don't forget that they spend more than 10 years in the same education trajectory. So we can wonder if diversity is high enough in those departments, then where the education of the employees or scholars are very similar. Why prestige in academic capital is more important than merits, labor, and production? So these questions, I think, should be posed, and we have to find justifications for employing those extremely elite educated scholars, because if we cannot find reasonable explanations, only prestige, then we have to talk about these inequalities, in my opinion. And also I wrote a book on these topics. So if you have time to read this, I think my argumentation would be more compelling. And I can also send you this book on PDF if you don't want to buy it. So no problem with that. So I'm not a representative of my publisher here. So if you are interested, you are welcome to ask it in email, and I can send you free Okay, so thank you very much for your attention now, and I will try to put the host to the next presenter, but
so if you go into participants and you look for Amitabh Baviskar.
Okay, I don't know how to do that, sorry.
Okay, if you just look at the participants button at the bottom.
Yeah, the problem is
stop sharing.
Just a minute.
Yeah, so if you stop share, if you go to the top of your screen.
Stop sharing, okay.
Now the buttons will reappear.
Yes, and
okay. Now if you click on participants.
Participants, yes.
You can then search the participants AB, Amita Baviskar.
Yeah, Amitabh Baviskar, yes. And
if you click on that, you'll see there are two buttons. And one is mute and one is more. If you click on more.
Yes, make host, I find it. Yes. Wow, I think it's okay for now.
Yes, Amita is now the host. So thank you for collaboratively working with us and also successfully keeping to time, even though we had the rather stressful thing about the screen sharing and also the starting late, and you've finished in wonderful fast time. So hopefully we will collect the questions. So what I'm saying is we'd like to have the whole very diverse panel together and then collect the questions and have a rich conversation at the end.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you.
So we invite Amita, if you want to share your screen.
Can you see the picture? I'm sorry, Su-Ming, can't hear you.
It's beautiful.
Oh, great. Okay. And in case you feel that the pictures have paused because my doing something wrong, please just interrupt me and let me know.
Yeah, if you want to say the next picture, then we'll know.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm actually only showing the pictures in order to give you a sense of the kind of places that I'm talking about and the kinds of people I'm talking about. As Su-Ming said, I'm a cultural anthropologist, sociologist by training, and I've spent most of my life thinking about questions of environment and development. And most recently in India, in Delhi, where I'm based, we've experienced and witnessed two tremendously important, almost sort of life-shaking events. One of which, of course, has been the pandemic since last year, which led to a complete economic lockdown starting from March last year, which was then extended with some lifting of the curbs, but which caused immense distress. And that's one event, the pandemic and the lockdown. That's the context for what I'm going to say. And the second event is what started around last December, a series of major farmers' protests, hundreds of thousands of farmers coming to the capital city and not being allowed to enter. So they just camped themselves on the border. And they're still protesting against farm laws, which make it a lot easier for corporate agribusiness to enter what has so far been primarily small and medium holder agriculture in India. Now, both of these issues, the pandemic as well as the situation of the farmers, have ecological issues at their center. And yet we find that the ecological aspects are really not addressed. So in these 20 minutes, what I'm going to do is talk about their predicament and then just discuss, why is it that ecology takes the back seat? And I know we've been discussing since the morning the talks in Glasgow. We've been talking about the students' movement globally. But what do these things look like at the ground level? How do people's actions individually or collectively take up this, what to my mind is a central question, namely that of the environment? So just to tell you about the larger context, we're really looking at about since the 1990s, when economic liberalization policies started in India, the trajectory of economic growth has been towards promoting large capital, corporate businesses at the expense of smaller ones. Policies such as demonetization that happened 5 years ago have also taken a tremendous toll on people who work in the informal sector, like these domestic workers that you see. People who, when the lockdown happened, lost their jobs, and they had so little money saved up, barely a week or two worth of savings, that most of them had no way of sustaining themselves. And most of them lived on rent in these kinds of informal settlements, rent that they could no longer pay from last year onwards. And many of them were people who had been thrown out of a rural economy, where the phenomenon of, well, there was hardly any growth, but whatever growth there was also jobless. So these are people who moved to urban areas in search of any kind of work at all. And the work that they found was by and large precarious. It was low paying, insecure, drudge work of the worst kind. But yet people hoped that it would at least tide them over. But because the urban employment that people received was so low paying, most of them still retain ties to their relatives and their homes in the country, which is why when the lockdown meant their savings ran out, they had no jobs in cities and in factories. We saw this exodus of hundreds of millions of people walking because state transport, trains and buses had just been shut down. In many cases, walking hundreds of kilometers or hitching rides on vehicles such as this, but just walking to get home to the village where they had kinship ties, where they might have, somebody, a relative with a bit of land, somewhat self-sustaining. So in this phenomenon, what I want to draw your attention to is the importance of rural and urban links for people. And yet a crisis that actually transcended these kinds of boundaries. Villages where, okay, they were free from disease, but there was no way of earning a living. And this is a situation that forced people into the kind of circumstances of migrant work that you see in these pictures. So this is the situation that we've been facing in India since the 1990s, gradually worsening, the concentration of wealth getting more and more amplified, inequality and so on. But what doesn't get talked about is the way in which this kind of economic growth has also been consistent with an undermining of local ecological systems. By which I mean that the growth, to the extent that has happened, has been through extractive industries, mining, etc., manufacturing, which has been hugely polluting. Agriculture has become more industrialized based on fossil fuels, the use of more fertilizers, pesticides, hybrid monocropping, and so on. And therefore, in this economy against ecology, various people have been basically in the urban and rural context, cutting the ground from under their own feet. And of course, there's an ecological dimension to the pandemic as well, the peculiar set of circumstances that brought, zoonotic diseases with the interaction between wild biodiversity and domesticated plants and animals, the change conditions for exposure, globalized travel that allowed the disease to spread around the world. These kinds of effects coming together to create what David Quammen calls spillover. So now in India, at least, the incidence of COVID-19 has subsided, thank goodness. But what we see is that the direction of investment in health is now heavily driven towards tertiary healthcare. Because when the big crisis happened this March, April, May, people couldn't find hospital beds, they couldn't find ventilators, oxygen. So what we see now is a boom in the pharmaceutical sector and a boom in tertiary healthcare at the expense of the more basic primary healthcare, clean water, sanitation kinds of developments that that earlier at least got paid lip service to. So the other situation that I talked about is a set of protests by farmers. But as I said, the fact that there are ecological reasons why such diseases spread, why vector-borne diseases like dengue and Zika and so on have been increasing in India is to do with environmental changes, increasing humidity because of at construction sites, irrigated fields, and so on. All of this is left out, and much though people said, oh, look, the skies are blue during the lockdown, or water is clean, there was no systematic way of trying to say, well, what can we do in order to preserve this unpolluted environment? Post-pandemic and post the lockdown, what we see is an attempt to return to business as usual, which means more pollution, gray sky is seen as a sign of, we're back to growth, and growth is good. The farmers' protests, as I said, have been largely to do with farm laws that take away government supports, subsidized inputs like electricity, subsidized, guaranteed minimum support prices, which allow farmers to sell, they're not completely exposed to what the market, is willing to pay for their produce. A system that has sustained farmers, big and small, across large parts of India, is now under threat because of corporate agribusiness being pushed by the government. But in the way in which the farmers' protest has been celebrated in India, and indeed it should be celebrated because it's the biggest challenge to a right-wing authoritarian government that is currently in power, what again gets left out is the fact that the kind of agriculture that has been supported by the state and which the farmers are defending right now is a model that is deeply ecologically destructive. Look at this particular picture, which is iconic of the kinds of protests that have been taking place. You see farmers on their tractors, and these tractors have displaced labor. They've displaced livestock, domesticated livestock, because earlier people used draft bullocks in order to plow their fields, and there's a whole closed ecological loop of manure from animals fertilizing the land and so on, which is now broken. And of course, the tractors are driven by diesel, which is responsible for, among other things, global warming. But these aspects of what is the ecological crisis by and large, do not get taken into account because the Green Revolution areas have been part of a countrywide system of subsidized white rice and wheat. And the areas, have been seen as, North India has been seen as the breadbasket of India, feeding the entire country. And in that narrative of the hardworking farmer feeding the country, what we don't get a sense of is the resource intensity of that kind of agriculture, be it in terms of water or synthetic chemicals or in terms of fossil fuels and so on. So how much time do I have? About 5 minutes, Su-Ming?
About 5 minutes. Yeah, you can take.
Okay. Okay. So having laid out both these two events which are ongoing, which have many of us have been completely absorbed in because of the immense layers of distress they talk about, but at the same time that hope with the farmers movement that we're looking at collective action that can be that's important. This question, which so many of us agree is a critical question, the question about the question about whether about the ecological underpinnings of these present day crises is just not getting addressed. And in my remaining 5 minutes, I want to talk about why that's the case. When this is something that is so alive in people's lives, why is it that they're not able to actually address it in their political demands? We know that economic resilience of the kind that the migrant workers find so hard to sort of stitch together in their lives is dependent on many things. It's dependent on assets and on access to welfare and government incomes and so on. But it is also hugely dependent on ecological security, which is, all the more, rendered fragile because of, among everything else, climate change. So given that uncertainty is such a large part now of people's lives, social, economic, political, ecological, where exactly do, say, people like farmers who deal with this in their everyday lives stand? And finally, how does the development discourse really help us address these issues on the ground? Very quickly, I think that, these are just sort of thoughts, and I would love to get your, get your responses on these. One, I think that farmers remain silent on the ecological costs of the agriculture they've been engaged in, the burden of ill health that it places on plants, animals, soils, water, and of course humans, is that, in many ways, it is a sort of classic illustration of what, of Marx's theory of metabolic rift, where capitalist agriculture leads to a rupture between nature and society. So alienation from nature, in the sense of depleting water, biodiversity, soil fertility, is accompanied by farmers' alienation from nature. Farmers haven't been able to respond or recognize to this ecological crisis in their midst, because from the 1970s onwards, the state has encouraged them towards resource-intensive farming of the Green Revolution kind, and then insulated them from the worst impacts by providing them, cheap resources, shifting the environmental burden spatially as well as temporally. This was the implicit bargain of cheap food, producing cheap food in return for state support. So there is also the powerful hegemonic presence of the Green Revolution ideology, which means that farmers no longer have a sense of their own expertise and ability to think and act independently. It's also the compulsion of capitalist relations of production, which means that people feel we have to extract as much from the land as possible. So there are some organizations and individuals who've been trying to make agriculture more sustainable ecologically in North India. But it's very hard to have a large scale shift given the inertia and the entrenched habits of mind and action over the last 50 years. And the Green Revolution model still prevails as the aspirational standard for all classes of farmers across regions. In fact, poorer farmers get more and more vulnerable, put their lives and their households at risk because they're trying to climb onto this. Having said that, my last comment is about the development discourse. And that's about the ways in which those I see as working in the realm of development studies, development action, development practice. In some ways, we've all been forced to narrow down our focus. If earlier we talked about redistribution of assets, now we can just about talk about redistribution of incomes, the idea of a welfare state. No one's now even talking about equalizing life chances. It's about the reproduction of precarity, barely making ends meet because of, if you look at the small amounts that people get in terms of universal basic income, as pensions, as employment guarantee. This is actually getting squeezed in such a way that our imagination of what is possible, what we can even talk about, what we can ask of governments that are increasingly hostile to any kind of radical imagination. You get slapped in jail in Delhi, in India, if you're a college student who's active in Fridays for Future on charges of sedition. So in this scenario, I think that for all that Su-Ming said, we need to talk about hope and creativity and improvising ingenious solutions. I think it is actually a very bleak time. And sometimes crises have their own momentum and they generate opportunities for change, but only after extraordinary hardship. So it's not quite clear to me what the present crisis, which seem almost catastrophic in scale in terms of the suffering that they have induced, really actually hold for us. They seem primarily defensive measures, trying to hold on to the modicum of what people actually have, even though it is so precious little. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Amita. A lot to think about, and we've still got good amount of time. So can you, Risha, maybe I can reclaim the host, or can you go in
Do that?
and
I can do that. Yeah, I'm
yeah,
sorry, I should have done that
Stephen,
right
yeah.
away.
I think he's
Yeah.
Stephen Advocacy, yeah?
Yes, he is, and I'm making him host right now.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks a million. Just a reminder to everyone to mute their mics if you're not the speaker. Thanks. And again, collect your questions and we'll have them in the chat and discuss more broadly. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Su-Ming, and thank you to the Development Studies Association for the invitation. What I'm going to do is to try to position international development vis-a-vis neoliberalism and the Sustainable Development Goals, and to talk about the correlation between neoliberalism and global poverty, and assess the Sustainable Development Goals as the main policy response within the international development sector to global poverty. And then hopefully discuss the need to plot an alternative course for development and indeed the need to revisit the term development entirely, I think, in the context of COVID-19 and neoliberalism. I'm going to start with a couple of definitions. This one is from the development education sector in which I work. It's from our National Development Network, Development Education Network IDEA. And it says that development education is an educational process which enables people to understand the world around them and to act to transform it. It works to tackle the root causes of injustice and inequality globally and locally to create a more just and sustainable future for everyone. The emphasis on root causes is mine because what I think is lacking and has been lacking for some time in both the international development sector and the dev ed sector is an analysis of the root causes of poverty and inequality, particularly the role played by neoliberalism, which I think should be central to our discourse with each other and should be central to our discourse with learners, should also be central to our advocacy work with governments. But at present, from what I can see, from what I experience as a practitioner in the sector, that doesn't seem to be the case. Here's another definition, this time of international development. This one's from Concern. International development is focused on engaging with economically disadvantaged regions to empower people to improve their well-being and address the causes, again, the emphasis is mine, and effects of poverty. So we're all agreed that what we should be doing is tackling the root causes of poverty and injustice and inequality and the climate emergency. But are we doing that? Because I believe that the main cause of these things, the main source of our social and economic ills, is neoliberalism, this extreme form of capitalism that has dominated and driven development over the last 40 or 50 years. So here are some recent stats on global poverty. Half the world's population lives on $5.50 a day. The number of billionaires increased during the pandemic by 660 to 2,755 by 2021. I think this is a sign of a dysfunctional economy when we see these kind of extremities of wealth. It's not an indication of a healthy society. The collective wealth of these billionaires in 2021 was $13 trillion, an increase of 8 trillion on 2020. The richest 1% produced 15% of the world's carbon emissions. So by addressing the extremities of wealth, we would also be at least in part addressing the climate emergency. And then finally, the monetary unpaid work of all women globally is calculated, this is by Oxfam, to be at least 10.8 trillion annually, 3 times the size of the world's tech industry. But this work is not valued or considered by neoliberalism because it doesn't generate a profit. In fact, I would suggest that the tobacco sector or the arms sector would probably be valued a lot higher because it generates profits. And in the metric of GDP, gross domestic product, which is the metric of choice for neoliberalism, than it would the unpaid work of all of the women globally. This is how socially disconnected neoliberalism is and has become. So this article by the Guardian journalist George Monbiot suggests that neoliberalism is the ideology at the root of all of our social and economic ills. He suggests that it's the reason why we had the financial meltdown in 2008. This economic system is chaotic, it's unreliable, it's prone to crises. It's the reason why we're in this existential environmental crisis. And it's even one of the reasons why we're seeing the rise of the far right across the world as people become disconnected from politics because of entrenched poverty around the world. So some characteristics of neoliberalism, and apologies if you know all of these, and I'm sure many of you do, but it reduces the role of the state in economic planning and decision making. This, as we know under neoliberalism, the market knows best. They have this fantasy called trickle-down economics. In a market-based system, there is a rising sea of prosperity in which we're all raised like ships. In theory, as I say, we've seen how chaotic and unstable the system is. Neoliberalism supports the privatization of public services like health, education, utilities, transportation. And during the pandemic, we've seen how healthcare systems that have been hollowed out from decades of neoliberalism have been unequal to the challenges presented by COVID-19. It believes that tariffs on imports should be lifted, often to disastrous effect in the global south, where indigenous industrial sectors are often wiped out by cheaper imports from the global north. It supports tax cuts for the rich and the gradual erosion of the welfare state. And these reforms, that's putting it
Tell me when you want
benignly,
to move, Hannah.
these reforms have been disastrously
Yeah, it's
imposed
fine.
on countries in the global south for decades through the structural adjustment programs of the IMF and the World Bank. They continue to be imposed on poor countries despite their disastrous outcomes. What does our sector have to say about this? This is a definition of neoliberalism, suggesting how we become commodified ourselves as citizens. Neoliberalism sees competition as the defining characteristic of human relations. It redefines citizens as consumers whose democratic choices are best exercised by buying and selling, a process that rewards merit and punishes inefficiency. It maintains that the market delivers benefits that could never be achieved by planning. Again, a fantasy as we've seen. The coronavirus has basically entrenched inequalities that were already present as a result of neoliberalism, and it has deepened those and entrenched them. Oxfam produced this really good report at the start of the year called The Inequality Virus. And this is a quote lifted from that report. It says, "The coronavirus has swept across a world that was already extremely unequal. This inequality is the product of a flawed and exploitative economic system, which has its roots in neoliberal economics and the capture of politics by elites. It has exploited and exacerbated entrenched systems of inequality and oppression, namely patriarchy and structural racism ingrained in white supremacy." In other words, neoliberalism doesn't just engender inequality, it is deeply sexist and deeply racist. So, in my opinion, this is Banksy's elephant in the room. In my opinion, neoliberalism is, for our sector, it should be at least, the neoliberalism, it should be the elephant in the room. It should be central to everything that we do. And yet it isn't. Of course, the million-dollar question is, why isn't it? And perhaps we can get to that in the conversation that we have later. So if we're not talking about neoliberalism within international development very much, what are we talking about? Well, we spend a lot of time talking about these things. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals designed to eradicate poverty in all its forms everywhere by 2030. A couple of things to say straight off the bat about the SDGs. One, there isn't a snowball's chance in hell that they're going to be achieved in 2030. and two, they're completely contradictory. You have goal 8, for example, which is calling for an increase in GDP in the least developed countries of 7%.
I thought they actually wanted the.
And
Sorry,
yet,
Judith Randall, can you just mute your mic?
But yeah, so it's outrageous.
Sorry,
Judith
Judith
Randall.
Randall, can you mute your mic, please?
But of course, they won't exchange. You have to pay them before you exchange, don't you?
She's not listening.
Yes, and to GDPR.
Stephen, I think as host, you're actually able to
Yes,
mute.
Stephen, can you just mute? Can you just go into
how
the
do I do that?
participants?
Participants, right?
Yeah, into participants.
And who am I looking for?
And just
Judith
hover
Randall.
over Judith.
Right. Okay.
And then mute.
Ask to unmute or
No,
No.
just mute. There's a mute. There's a mute button. I think.
There's a mic there. Just click on that.
yeah, I'm looking for Judith. Do you see her? It should be alphabetical, right? Maybe she's done it already because I don't hear
People
anything
who
now.
are buying it are probably more desperate.
No,
than
she's
we
not on mute.
Oh, there
yet.
she is.
Yeah,
Mute. There you go.
thanks.
Okay.
Sorry, Stephen.
You're okay. So what I was saying was that I think there's a contradiction at the heart of the SDGs between those goals that are calling for growth and those that are calling for the mitigation and addressing of the causes and effects of climate change. So I see the goals as being complicit with neoliberalism. And yet there's scarcely any criticism or critique of the SDGs, despite the fact that our sector champions them. So I think at the very least, as a matter of good practice in international development and development education, our sector should be critiquing the goals. If you look at the activities of the organizations in our sector and in higher education, a lot of them are dominated and premised upon the goals, yet they don't seem to be critiquing the goals. They just seem to assume that the goals represent good practice in international development. I don't think they do. And thankfully, it's not just me saying this. This guy said it in a really outstanding report last summer. This is Philip Alston, the UN Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. And he outlined a series of flaws that exist within the goals. I'm just going to set out a few of them, not in a lot of detail. But first of all, in regards to eradicating poverty, he says the goals use an international poverty line of $1.90 a day as a barometer of poverty, which he says is too low a level to support a life of dignity consistent with basic human rights. And I think he's right. It means that if all of the goals were achieved successfully by 2030, there would still be millions of people living in poverty. What if you live on $2 a day or $3 a day? Isn't it right to think that those people are living in poverty? I think it is. In terms of human rights, he says there's not a single reference to any specific civil and political right, and human rights in general remain marginal and often invisible in the SDG context. In terms of finance, he says the goals are too dependent on private sector funding and philanthropy, which calls into question their sustainability as a public good. In terms of inequality, he found low levels of attention by governments with this issue, particularly in regards to gender. The monitoring and evaluation instruments for the SDGs, particularly the annual high-level political forum, he describes as weak and ineffective. The SDGs, he says, are characterized by bland reports and colorful posters. I've talked already about the correlation between growth and the SDGs. They don't problematize growth. They don't problematize neoliberalism. And I think that's a fundamental flaw. And as a result of that, they're not making any impact in regards to climate change. The rapporteur found that the goals have had little impact in slowing climate change. In summary, he says, the UN and its member states are sleepwalking towards failure. 5 years after their adoption, it's time to acknowledge that the SDGs are simply not going to be met. There's an additional thing that's not in his report. The SDGs completely disregard history. They disregard the exploitative 500-year history from 1492 onwards between the global north and the global south. How can you frame any kind of development intervention in the global south unless you look at things like slavery, ecocide, indigenous genocide, and colonization, many of which are still happening today by other means. So you cannot frame any kind of development process without taking into consideration and informing them by that history. That history is absent from the framework of the SDGs. So in my opinion, we sit at a crossroads in our sector. Either we trudge down the road to 2030 with the Sustainable Development Goals toward, as the rapporteur said, assured failure, knowing that they represent a dodgy analysis of international development, knowing that they're complicit with neoliberalism, knowing that they're not going to be achieved. And the alternative, I think, is the only thing that we have to confront this, which is addressing the question of neoliberalism and incorporating it into our practice. So I've suggested a few things that we need to do in regards to neoliberalism. We need to problematize growth and produce a coherent critique of neoliberalism as part of our day-to-day practice. Neoliberalism needs to be central to our advocacy work with government and decision makers. And this is a local problem, not just a global problem, because Ireland is one of the most neoliberal countries in the world. It's awash with foreign capital, it's a tax haven, and it has many problems that are caused directly by neoliberal reforms, like homelessness, like a very poor health sector. We also need to introduce neoliberalism into our discourse with learners. As a development educator, this is something I'm very conscious of, that we don't really discuss this issue with our learners as part of our day-to-day practice in schools or in communities, and we should. And then finally, I think we need to introduce, we need peer education on how neoliberalism works and how it can be resisted in our discourse with each other. And again, I don't think that's something we've been doing enough of. So perhaps colleagues might have some thoughts on how we address this question in the conversation. So I'll stop there. So thank you very much.
Now, what am I going to do? I want to reclaim the hosting. And there's, oh dear. Sorry, Sean and Galea, you were waiting to be admitted. Don't know how long for, sorry. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just do a quick kind of like a roundup, just for no more than 4 or 5 minutes. And in that time also, if you have questions that you want to put into the space, then please put them in the chat, or use the, I normally just kind of use the chat space to kind of just write the chat box to just like write the question, organize my thoughts, if you'd like to do that while I'm wittering on. So a really kind of a brilliant panel, and it really shows, I think, the importance, the urgency, the breadth, and also the depth of this particular approach to development studies, which is critical development studies. I want to kind of try and think across these 3 very different presentations. Marton on academic knowledge, prestige, and who gets to become somebody who produces knowledge about development studies, about development. And these problems that he pointed to from his empirical study of scientometrics, you know, PhDs, who recognizes what PhDs and what, you know, who gets the jobs. And this is existentially important for people who are, who want to be experts in development studies, who are scholars of development studies, because, you know, the one takeaway is really, you know, this asymmetry, this lack of cultural prestige for the productive knowledge of the scholars who are trained, and their training in the Global South and their institutions. And there's something that I saw in common, I think, with something that Amita said that really stuck in my head. And this again came down to this immovability of the green revolution in India, this way of agricultural production that's extraordinarily hegemonic and institutionalized, but needs to change, but is very difficult to change. And how this, if it both affects and is the effect of the de-skilling and intellectual underutilization of the knowledge of the people for whom food production or knowledge production really, really matters. The scholars themselves, the farmers themselves, the laborers themselves. So something around this critical theme of knowledge and how knowledge is valued. And this seems to me to be something that in critical development studies, we really, really need to become more interested in as scholars, as advocates, as policy engaged people. We need to think about how do we value knowledge differently, because the change is going to be impossible if we cannot find ways to value knowledge differently, to bring these critiques that we know existentially are something to do with Stephen's elephant in the room. And that neoliberalism is in the room, not because it works, because it doesn't work. For a vast majority of people, it results in more inequality, which puts more magnifying glasses on the other inequalities, the horizontal inequalities of racism and sexism. So these are just like the few remarks, the connections I'm making in my mind between the different talks. And I take it absolutely what Amita says, that hope and creativity are necessary, but also we have to understand the catastrophic times that we are living in. This doubling down of authoritarianism, of fascism, of inegalitarianism of different kinds in a very totalizing, violent and unjust manner, affecting people's lives and their dignity and sense of selves very, very deeply, but existentially affecting people's lives. So I think this is also this pandemic layer that has been put on our critical consciousness that magnifies a magnifying lens on all those things that we already knew were problems, the elephant in the room. So the pandemic just, puts a magnifying glass up to the elephant as if we couldn't see the elephant already, since it was quite large, even if it was decorated to match the furnishings in the room. So that the question then, as scholars, I think is very clear for us. What we need to focus on is really about this, knowledge, epistemic injustice, and the problems of inequality, and how, let's say, even in the Sustainable Development Goals, inequality is kind of hidden in plain sight, because people can't remember or understand a list of 17 things. If you bury something in number 10, and then arrange colorful 16 other colorful things around it, then somehow it'll be kind of diminished or not noticed. But I think we need to take that inequality question out and make that really at the center, because that's the cause, the effect, the intensifier of the critical questions, it seems to me. And not to forget poverty. Because yes, we can think about inequality, which is a distributional issue, which is about distributions of prestige, of money, of wealth, of capabilities across a society. But we also need to think about, this is really something from Amita's visceral and beautiful visual capture of what it is that we need to pay attention to. And that poverty is about deprivation, and it's about needs. It's about the universal basis of humanity. And this really brings me to the point that Stephen mentioned. I'm very glad you mentioned Philip Alston, who I absolutely adore, and think his reports are absolutely on point, that you need to focus on why have we made poverty this miserable level of poverty, which is way beyond what is needed for human dignity. For any most basic form of inequality is a dehumanizing standard of poverty, and we should not accept it. So, Anita and I have chapters in this new book edited by Suzanne Egan and Anna Chadwick on poverty and human rights. And Anita also, draws attention to these kind of existential issues of what does inequality mean when it also is about poverty. It's at the bottom of the distribution of inequality. And I've also written about this issue of when the level is too low and the of poverty and deprivation is so low as not to deny even the possibility of equality, the basic humanity and basic sameness of the humanity of people at the bottom of the ladder. And when the ladder itself is now reaching to Mars. It's such a tall ladder that the people at the top of the ladder are actually living in a completely different universe from the people at the bottom of the ladder and have no concept of what is going on. So those are the ingredients, I think, of the Sustainable Development Goals. They sort of are a bit right-see. Their human rights are kind of anywhere, somewhere, but they're not, they're kind of everywhere-ish, but they're not actually somewhere. And that is the problem with Sustainable Development Goals and why they're not reducing inequality, because they don't put what is the most basic equality somewhere, which must be the human rights, the equality of rights. So that's just my little response for now. And let's open it up. Let me just have a look in the chat and see who would like to have questions. My God, there's so much stuff in the chat now. So Nita, you just have a very quick thing that you want to remark, that you want to say to Marton?
Yeah, no, I like the idea of, his concepts, which I hadn't come across: academic inbreeding or intellectual inbreeding or elite Western education. And I like the fact that he's put it out boldly, and that is why one of the reasons we did invite you, Demeter, to have these conversations in Ireland when we heard you at the EADI. So I'm glad it's here. And I just made a comment, linkages in all three presentations. Thank you, they were fantastic and kind of collate everything. And what we are talking about is the way, Stephen, you put out, the reason we are not talking about the real issues is because we are hung up about the SDGs and we think it's going to solve our problems and we all know it will not. So it's like to pull out the blinders on all of these, the things that you all have spoken today, where I see on elite Western education, academic inbreeding, silence of state policies, or the Punjab farmers on ecology, ecological friendly farming, on history and colonialism, racism, and worldviews is something that hasn't come up, which is actually my pet project right now. Spiritual worldviews or of indigenous people. I don't want to use the word religion here. I'm very wary of using institutional religion, but worldviews of people. And we just kind of relegate that to the background, saying, oh, indigenous people have a different worldview. But people like you and me also have worldviews which are ecologically friendly, for example. I mean, as a Hindu, I definitely have. And our task as development scholars is probably to pull out these blinders, the way we call it out openly and have an open discussion without fear. And thank you for bringing that. Thanks, Su-Ming, for the panel.
So I see Marton has a little comment that he would like to give. I think I've asked him to unmute.
Yes, I was asked by the host, but yeah, I have a comment because I think your summary was just outstanding, because I forget to add to geopolitical inequalities that this is intersectional with other kinds of inequalities. And I think because this is my field of research, then this is especially true for research and education, because if you are female or if you are from poor family, your likelihood to end up in a top position in an elite university is even lower than it would be when you are from a rich family who can afford to send you abroad for education. We also know, and we absolutely find in our research, that in top positions, in full professor positions, there are much less female scholars than amongst assistant professors. So the level of inequalities are totally intersectional. And if you are not white, not male, not from the global north, your chances for getting a higher position in the global academia is pretty much lower. And I think this is because as I put it in a comment that, and in a response with Stephen's wonderful presentation, that the logic of research and global academia and global higher education exactly follows the logic of the neoliberal markets. So all about prestige, all about the privileges of the 1% at the top of the hierarchy, and others are silenced, others are in many cases disqualified. The people on top position tend to think that those people educated in the global south has less knowledge, they are not qualified for joining to the international discussion on this or that topic. So I think higher education and global research is a very good example in which we can see how inequalities work in different levels, how they are intersectional, and how they are follows the logic of the neoliberal market. So thank you very much, because I think, yeah, as you summarized why the presentations were different, the logic behind them was exactly the same. So I'm very happy for that.
So I'm going to give the floor to Amita to either ask a question or have a comment. And then after, I'm going to go to Laura Eustace.
Thank you, Su-Ming. I'm going to respond to your comments and to a couple of things in the chat as well. And I'll try and do it briefly. Well, you know, this question of what is development, I always go back to Jim Ferguson's book, The Anti-Politics Machine. And I think that those of us who are in the so-called development sector, be it development studies as academics, or be it people working in multilateral institutions, development NGOs, we actually have a stake in reproducing this development discourse, even if we come up with radical sounding new ideas every decade or so. And I think we have to recognize that we're far too complicit and far too comfortable to really be at the center of, or at the vanguard of change. So where is change going to come from? Especially when I describe this kind of overwhelming institutionalized agricultural commitment to an ecologically destructive and inequitable form of agriculture. Well, I think that change is going to come from people who are already struggling on the ground. I think, for instance, of groups of low-caste women farmers in Eastern India, the Deccan Development Society, that is trying to go back to organic agriculture and claim rights to land and to low intensive environmental use, but who also therefore have to exploit and build on a conjuncture with affluent urban consumers who want organic produce, with people who are willing to pay a premium for clothes in organic cotton. Now, of course, there are contradictions here, because there's a form of green consumerism that's actually being fostered. But it's something that's allowing these really very badly off women to create a space for themselves and a livelihood. And I think that in the political environment, even though currently it's so overwhelmingly bleak, there are still enough contradictions to exploit. There are still, all we can do, or all that these groups can do, is to keep at it and try and be better. So, given that everybody is now, because of our subsidized food system, hooked to you eating white rice and wheat, destroying the kind of, culinary diversity India has been famous for, and regional diversity and so on. We need, we have a right to food campaign that's actually saying that we need to supply more millets as the cereals which are more nutritious, that are less resource intensive in cultivation, and that give poorer farmers in dryland areas their livelihoods. So these are the kinds of ongoing battles that we have. And if our present government is defeated, which I hope they are in the next elections, we might see more of these efforts becoming being noticed by other political parties, and we have to work towards widening that as much as possible.
So now I see Laura has a question still for you, Amita. So maybe
okay.
I asked Laura to open. She can maybe open her mic.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi. Welcome.
Hi. I'll keep my video off because I'm not I'm sitting here in my pajamas. But Amita, I was just wondering, your presentation spoke to me a lot because I come from a farming family in the US, and this is something that I've been trying to push them towards, as well as working with some very ecologically minded farming initiatives. Something that we are having a big problem with in the US is just this question of equity and ecology, and how do we bring those together? Specifically creating buy-in with these smaller farmers they just don't have the capital to switch systems. And the capital that is available to them through like grants and stuff usually get eaten up by these big agricorps. And it kind of leaves them out in the cold and their concerns are not addressed. I was wondering if you have any ideas as to how to kind of bring this, ecology movement in farming and equity together, because oftentimes I feel like one or the other is left out of the equation.
Thanks. I mean, that's a really complex question to try and answer, because the answer does differ, I think, from place to place. So, I wouldn't presume to speak about what's happened in different regions in the US. But the place that I know reasonably well is India. And there, I think there's certain kinds of things we can build on. One of them is that in India, by and large, the vast majority of farmers are small or medium farmers, which means that they have, less than, say, 10 acres of land that they're cultivating at a time. And this is, I won't go into the reasons why that's the case, but that means that the kind of concentration of land holdings that has happened in countries like the US, where corporates own, like tens of thousands of acres of land, that's not even feasible in the Indian context. And a lot of corporations don't want it because the costs of managing it, the transaction costs, are much too high for them. So their entry point is through agricultural machinery and through agricultural chemicals. And that's where the indebtedness of the kind that killed the family farm in the US comes in. And so farmers are sort of still insisting that the government help them to have access to subsidized inputs. But in some states, at least, what we see is an emphasis, especially in the hill states, to say that let's try and move to what they call zero budget natural farming. Let's make sure we are using as few chemical inputs as possible. And while this is still sort of on paper and the policy hasn't really been, implemented on the ground, it does create more room for maneuver in terms of the smaller organizations trying to seize the moment and work with a different model of more sustainable agriculture. So you're absolutely right that, in the US, we've seen ecology, but that ecology, organic agriculture, is practiced by these giant agri-corporations. And so equity is out of the picture because they're still, using migrant workers as farm laborers and minimum wages, if that. And of course, it's not particularly ecological if you're eating organic asparagus, which is flown 1,000 miles to be there in your supermarket. So there are so many complex issues in all of this, which we have to kind of, tackle together one by one. And there's interesting research on how this is being done. If you're interested, you could contact me later, and there's a series of articles and books that I could mention, which actually try and think about ecology and equity in Indian agriculture together. But thanks for your question.
Thank you, Amita.
So just to add just one little point to that, I mean, in our own locality, we're experimenting locally in Galway and County Clare with high nature value farming, but this requires the European Union and also community supported agriculture to agree to pay nature value premiums to the farmers who will produce high quality and nutritious products while maintaining landscape beauty value and high nature value in the very unusual particular places of the Burren Geopark, for example. So they maintain the geopark and they maintain the botanical diverse flora because it's a Natura 2000 site. And they produce cattle who also provide services for the heritage. So they have cattle who are employed by the heritage body to maintain the landscape, because if they didn't graze it in the particular way, then we would not have cultural tourism to the specific landscape of the Burren, which is a landscape created by traditional farming. So it's just a kind of a little example.
Wow. Okay.
I didn't bring you there, huh? Come, you have to come again when we travel is a thing again. We'll go and we'll see this place.
Wow, that would be fantastic.
Yes, please. Now, Merit has a question.
Yes, hello. I'm really sorry. I have a very unstable internet connection, so I hope you can hear me, and I hope I'm going to stay with you. So I had a question about the Sustainable Development Goals, because I wanted to know if we criticize growth and neoliberalism and take this lens to look at the development goals, can they still function as a guideline? Like, can they be useful, not only maybe for scholars, but also for NGOs, for example? I was thinking about an island I visited when I was in Scotland, the Isle of Aick, and there are only 200 people living there, and they're influenced by these sustainable development goals to try and live climate neutral, have no carbon footprint or very low one, to produce locally. So I think this is a very good example, maybe a good example of how these goals might work if they're actually implemented with this critical lens, or would you say that nonetheless we need to get rid of them and we need to find a completely new way to look at these things and these problems?
Do you want me to answer that? Do you want me to answer
I think
that,
it's for you, Stephen.
Yeah, I think so. The answer to that question depends on who you speak to, because a lot of my colleagues in development education build a lot of their practice on the SDGs and think that they're very good. I take a different view because I'm concerned that they don't problematize growth primarily. That's my biggest worry about it. They don't critique the current model of development that's precipitated the climate crisis. That's driving inequality. And because they're not doing that, they're not in a position to address the problems that they're trying to fix. That's primarily why I think they're so far off track. They don't have the capacity to address the root causes of inequality and injustice. Now, some colleagues in development education believe that SDG 4.7, which is concerned with global citizenship education, provides a basis for good development education practice or good awareness raising practice. And we've had a big Europe-wide program called Bridge 47, which has supported a lot of development education activity based on 4.7. But do we need the SDGs to deliver effective development education? I don't think we do. And I think there's a risk in attaching the SDGs, because they have such a very flawed analysis and critique of development and poverty and the climate emergency, that it could undermine our development education practice. That's why I don't engage with them for that reason. We have already a very sound basis for Dev Ed in the theory and practice of Paulo Freire, which can easily be adapted and implemented in countries across the world. It comes from the global south, and it works. It works really effectively. I think all the time about the climate strikers. They don't have resources, and yet they mobilize millions of people around the world in a way that most development NGOs can only dream about. And I've reflected a lot over the last year, but why do they have so much success in doing that, when Greta Thunberg started with this solitary protest outside the Swedish parliament, and then by September 2019, you had 7 million people participating in protests in hundreds of countries across the world? How did she do it? And I think the answer lies in, it wasn't a question of resources, because she had none. I think it was the way she speaks. She speaks truth to power, I think, in a way that most development NGOs are fearful of doing, in a way that the SDGs don't do. She has a power and a resonance because she won't be cowed by policymakers. And when they get it wrong, she calls them out. And NGOs are afraid to do that for a lot of different reasons, which we won't get into now. So I would follow her lead before I'd follow the lead of the SDGs. She inspires me, the SDGs don't.
I know we're actually at time, but I want to allow a question by Susan before we finish. I shan't abuse my chair.
Hi, how are you? Thanks so much, Su-Ming. I probably don't really have time for the question that I would love to hear a little bit about, but I just wanted to say I really, really enjoyed the conversations today. I'm really struck by the crisis, the intersecting crisis that have been so clearly outlined in terms of knowledge production, in terms of food systems, in terms of social reproduction, in terms of ecological systems and political systems. And I suppose I really, if anything, I really was hoping to get some comments on Gramsci's statement around the old is dying and the new cannot be born. I wanted to kind of get a sense from the panelists in terms of where do we go from now? And I also wanted to ask some questions around the relationship between understandings of prosperity as a driver of poverty, rather than as something to be aspired towards, and challenging I suppose the values and norms that influence thinking around prosperity. We focus so heavily on poverty as though it is somewhat completely removed from the pursuit of prosperity and particularly in more highly industrialized spaces. So I wanted to have I don't have time for the conversation, but these are the ideas that were prompted. And I just wanted to say thanks, Su-Ming, and thank you to the panelists for a fantastic, stimulating conversation this morning.
So I would like to let any of the panelists who would like, maybe in the order they came in, Marton, Amita and Stephen, to have the last word, even though we are slightly over time, because it's been such a lovely conversation.
No, it's just to say thank you, and it was really, really interesting and I think important discussion, and I'm very glad to be able to be here. So if you have any questions, you can email me because we don't have time, and see you next time. Thank you.
Any last words, Amita?
Well, I mean, Susan's just sort of actually opened it up to a huge, big conversation, right? And we're supposed to be ending. So, just thank you. Thank you for asking that. And I think that's a struggle we deal with every day. What are the positive things that we can see, and how do we help them become stronger? And, going back to Gramsci, I think it's looking for those contradictions and finding the room for maneuver within them, which is surely going to be different in different places, depending on the actual context that people work in. But you're right that there is a kind of unifying system that we're fighting against, where ideas of what it means to be happy have really in some ways been captured by the capitalist notion of consumerism. And when the whole world is in some way or the other aspiring towards that, the consequences for the planet and for our own ecological well-being are clearly devastating. But it's interesting to also to see the kinds of conversations taking place on this very issue. Concepts such as degrowth, well, at least people are talking about it. And for all that the concept may not be extendable to contexts where people are actually still trying to make a basic living, as in India, I think the fact that in industrialized nations there is this discussion is surely an important kind of step forward. But thanks to Su-Ming and the panel for this very thought-provoking dialogue.
Amita actually took the very words out of my mouth, because in response to the second part of Susan's question around prosperity, I was going to reference Jason Hickel's great work on degrowth. That he's just published a book recently called Less is More, which I would strongly recommend. I reviewed it for our journal. He's basically arguing that we generate far more growth than we actually need. So we could actually scale down production and growth without making us any poorer, just by having the existing resources redistributed on a fairer basis and applying them towards social need. It all kind of makes a lot of sense. And we did a lot of this in the post-war years when we had Keynesian economics dominating. We set aside money for health and education and other essential services. So it's not even that revolutionary. But yeah, Jason Hickel, degrowth, less is more. Have a look at that. I found that interesting. And thank you, Sue. Brilliantly chaired. Thank you.
So thanks, and I'll abuse my chair for 10 seconds to say that, of course, yes, Gramsci was interested in finding the new, making the new formation. So the new formation, what kind of counter-hegemonic alliance can there be? And intellectual leadership needs a vision of where the counter-hegemony is going to go, where the resistance wants to go. And I think, I've devoted the last number of years of my life in scholarship to the connection between human rights and human development, because I think they're about redefining the goals of development and the purposes of development and putting the human people at the center of development and treating people as if they're the real wealth of the nation. So that would be, my my last attempt to abuse my position as chair, and now I'm going to end the meeting because we need to go to the DSAI. So thank you, Susan. Thank you, the audience. Thank you, my wonderful students, Jordan, Merit, Laura. You've asked such great questions and brought such energy to the room and to our discussion. So thank you very, very much. Okay, finish my meeting now, and then it's the next meeting. I think Hugh has shared Amita says pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. We'll change to criticism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And maybe obstinacy of the will, stubbornness of the will. Okay, thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Su-Ming. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
And
Bye, everyone.
Participants. Yeah.
I'm ending the meeting now.